time for your bed. So I'll try to keep you awake. I'm a veterinarian. I work at the University of Georgia. I'm completing my PhD there, working with Drs. Mark Jackwood and Brian Jordan. And our lab emphasizes respiratory diseases, specifically bronchitis virus. But we also have experience working with infectious laryngotracheitis virus. And our lab works in coccidiosis too. So I've got several projects that we're working on now. And today, since we were asked to talk about air quality and poultry respiratory disease, we have some hot new data to share, never before been seen. But first, let's just talk about air quality. How do we define air quality? I'm sure everyone has an idea in our heads of what aspects are involved. And it's really multifactorial, as we all know. And dust is a major factor. Let's start on the right side. Dust is everywhere, right? Especially in a dusty poultry house. It's full of bacteria, feces, all sorts of things that can cause a harsher environment for chickens. And carbon dioxide. Typically, recommendations are to keep CO2 levels below about 5,000 ppm, ideally 3,500. And that gets emitted from heating systems and then, of course, gets exhaled. So then ammonia, that's our big topic. That's going to be one of the big points of today. But before I go in too much into ammonia, the temperature and relative humidity and ammonia all are really related. And I don't know how many of you have heard about it, but let's start with the temperature and humidity. And there are good ways to find out, how is the poultry air quality doing just by looking at these factors. So let's take temperature. And if you drop temperature from 80 degrees, I'm going to work in Fahrenheit because we're in America, but 80 degrees goes down by 20 degrees to 60 degrees. And so 80 degrees is probably a hot summer day, okay? And then in the nighttime, it cools down a little bit. And that's a big drop in temperature. And you've got to keep in mind that your humidity will climb when you do that. So when it drops 20 degrees, humidity goes up twice, goes up by half. And what that means is we want to keep conditions ideally between 50 and 70% of relative humidity. When you place chicks in the house, you don't want it to be too, if the humidity is too low, you get problems with dusty conditions, some respiratory health problems, and then your heating costs go up. But when humidity is too high, then you start to get that condensation. And that can happen on the litter. You get wet litter, and wet litter breeds high ammonia, right? And also it can chill the chicks and your birds as you get older. And so that's also something to keep really in mind. So ammonia is really closely related to relative humidity, and I'll show you how that really is in the next couple of slides. So what is ammonia? Let's start with, it's a colorless irritant gas produced during the decomposition of organic matter by bacterial deamination. Basically that means you've got poop in the environment, you've got litter, you've got water, you've got air, it all mixes together. And it all starts from uric acid. Our chickens excrete uric acid in their urine, and that gets converted into ammonia gas. That requires, in this fancy equation here, it requires the input of water and air. So naturally, if you think relative humidity goes really high, you've got more water, more moisture in the air, and that's just going to be expediting this reaction, creating more ammonia. So real life example, if you go from 80 degrees in the daytime, in the night it gets colder usually, especially in any environment. And what you have to keep in mind is, let's say you start with a relative humidity of about 60%. So when you go down from day to night, that humidity is now going to jump to 120%. And that's more than 100, so what are you going to get? Condensation. Wet birds, wet litter. So at night is when we really need to be careful of what our ammonia levels actually are, because that's where problems can arise. So I'll show you that first, when do we see ammonia? And it's most common during cold weather, especially, let's say, so I hear in the Philippines there's a lot of open-sided housing, but when it gets cold, you shut, or it gets too hot, you shut the curtains, right? And probably there's a whole range of different management practices all throughout the world. And here in the US, we try to keep our houses closed. We like to use tunnel ventilation when it's hot. We like to focus only on ventilation and not allow the outside conditions to affect what's going on inside, because what will happen is you go from day to night and then suddenly there's all this condensation, and that's not good. Reduced ventilation allows for the buildup of ammonia gas inside the house, but is not consistent. So in the wintertime especially, you're trying to reduce your heating bills. So what do? You shut down the house, and especially when you place baby chicks, they're not really producing much heat. So you're only relying on the heat that's trapped inside the house and the heat that's produced by your own propane gas, etc. So naturally, when your ventilation goes down, there's no place for that ammonia to go, so it's going to build up. And that's why it's usually more of a problem in our younger flocks. But as the flocks get older, the birds are producing more heat, you can start kicking up your ventilation, ammonia goes down, so it's less of an issue. And again, it can be much higher at night than during the day. And at the University of Georgia, we have some specialists who are experienced in poultry ventilation and broiler house management. This is Dr. Fairchild and Mike Sarek, who've put together these beautiful graphs that illustrate what actually happens day in and night in. So the green here is the inside temperature that's inside the chicken house, and then the black is the outside temperature, and then the red is ammonia. On this x-axis, you see this is over the course of 1 or 2 weeks, and you go from day to day, and you notice that the outside temperature, when it's highest, this is in the middle of the day, like 1 to 3 o'clock p.m., right? And then at night, it drops precipitously to 40 degrees or so. And you see a sort of similar decrease and rise in temperature inside the house, but because in theory you're using really good management practices, that temperature decrease or increase is going to be very minimal. But notice here, this big red flag here, so as your outside temperature decreases and your inside temperature goes down a little bit, this ammonia spikes. And it spikes to 50 parts per million. And general recommendations, it's really hard to say, but they usually say try to keep it below 30 ppm, and ideally below even 20 ppm. And I'm going to show you why today. So what that means as veterinarians, as producers out in the field, is when you go and you check these houses, don't go at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, go at 3 o'clock in the morning, so you know what's really going on. Again, this is just another way of showing the data. What we've added now is relative humidity in this blue. And notice how beautifully relative humidity and ammonia are related. So ammonia sensors are really expensive. I wouldn't expect anybody to just go out and buy one. Ours, just for research purposes, costs about $8,000. You can't always put those in houses. So what you can do instead is measure where that relative humidity is and get it's a general proxy of what ammonia levels are. This is from the Georgia Poultry Lab Network. We're in the heart of broiler territory, if you remember, I think from Dr. Bautista's lecture. And we have received submissions over several years. And my point to you here is that, as we've seen in another lecture, respiratory disease incidence increases in the winter times. So you see this rise during the winter, January, February, March here, and again here. And we also, with a lower ventilation in the winter time, trying to save energy, we also do see that concurrent increase in ammonia levels. So naturally, we would assume, well, it kind of makes sense, right? High ammonia, it's a toxic gas, and when it's higher in the winter time, we're going to get more disease. So it would make sense that ammonia would predispose birds to disease infection. So let's talk about a little bit about what does ammonia do to the birds. So generally, when birds are exposed to really high levels of ammonia, they can have photophobia, or just be really sensitive to the light because they have conjunctivitis, inflammation, and in really high levels, they can even have corneal ulceration and blindness. So that's like over 100 ppm for a long period of time, or in one study that actually documented this really well. They were even exposed to 1,000 ppm, which is way out of the limits of what we normally go to. I mean, how many people have walked into a broiler house and your throat starts itching, your eyes start burning a little bit? I have, and I mean, it can even start at 50 ppm. And the longer you've been in these houses, the more used to it you get, right? And then you can't smell it anymore, and then you're like, oh, this is great, and really it's not. So just keep that in mind as you continue.
I thought it was menthol.
So this is actually a generic photograph of increased mucus secretion in the trachea. It could be anything, really. But ammonia also increases mucus production from goblet cells. And it seems to decrease the ability of the cilia to clear the mucus. Because cilia are really good at clearing mucus, but when there's so much, and we've seen, for example, in ILTs, birds, they can suffocate on their own blood. There's no way that the cilia can actually clear that much liquid. So that could be a problem, because mucus is really important to trap bacteria, viruses, debris, you name it. Let's go through a little bit of the history of our ammonia studies, because there's actually not that much information. And up here, I've actually presented pretty much most of what we know about ammonia up until today, starting in 1964, which was, oh my gosh, like 53 years ago. So in this one study, this was actually done in 2004, so not that long ago, they looked at ammonia concentration effects on conjunctivitis, tracheal lesions, and pulmonary lesions in birds that were exposed. These were broiler chicks raised from day of age to 21 days, so 3 weeks of exposure of ammonia at either 0, 30, or 60 ppm. And the only real differences they noticed was in that conjunctivitis, in that even at like moderately low levels, 30 ppm, that's still within the guidelines, you do see a jump in conjunctivitis. So keep that in mind. This was over 21 days, but they do seem to have signs. And these birds, what you'll start to notice in these studies that were done, most of these birds were all raised in chambers, so in isolated environments where they took an ammonia gas canister and infused the chamber with ammonia, and usually didn't have any other bacterial challenges or other air quality infused into the chamber. So this is done in an insulated environment. Ammonia, some other studies they've done, and this got cut off, but it's still okay because the important thing is, I'll just explain, but it has lung effects too. So these birds, these were like 6 to 8 week old layers, and they were exposed to 0 or 50 ppm of ammonia for the course of 3 weeks. And what they noticed was, this is an electron micrograph of the lung. And I apologize for how this turned out, but what they noticed was that these walls here, these are normal walls, they were thickened in the birds that were exposed to ammonia. And the higher levels, when they were exposed to 75 to 100 ppm, their walls got thicker. And what that does is it decreases the surface area for gas exchange. And they think that that could be involved in like heat loss mechanisms and regulation. Birds, I mean, especially these big broilers, they need adequate gas exchange. The effects of ammonia on performance parameters is also very well studied. This is not the scope of this study, but I felt that it would be remiss to not bring up the fact that ammonia does affect body weight and feed conversion. So this study, again in 2004, they looked at birds, commercial broilers reared from day of age for the first 4 weeks of their lives. And they exposed them to either 25, 50, or 75 ppm of ammonia. They were in chambers again, and they looked at what their body weight was at each period. So after 4 weeks, there was a depression of 17% in body weight between the controls and the 50 ppm birds. There was a 21% reduction as you went up higher to 75%. But the really interesting thing is that you see that at 7 weeks, so these birds stopped getting ammonia and they were grown out to 7 weeks of age, they recovered some of that body weight difference. They had a rebound effect, where now that 17% is now 6%. And that 21% now became 9%. So there is evidence, and this was in broilers again, so there's evidence that these birds have the ability to be exposed to ammonia. And maybe there's an initial insult, initial effect, but they seem to recover and to compensate for the poor environmental conditions. This is another way of just showing what I told you, and you see this gradation from 0 to 25 to 50 to 75 ppm. You start to notice weight differences after about 2 weeks of age, and that continues all the way until 7 weeks. What research has shown thus far is that ammonia causes conjunctivitis, corneal ulcers, and photophobia. Now remember, that's at really high concentrations. Most of the time, they won't have that. Increased mucus secretion, changes in the lung architecture, which can affect the gas exchange ability, and cilia damage. And I'll show you some really cool videos about that later. But really, why does this all matter? We need to know what's actually the biological significance of this. Cilia, let's go back to 9th grade or wherever you learned about cilia. They're hair-like projections that line the lumen of the trachea, and they expel the mucus from the airway. And remember, mucus traps all the things that we don't want in the body, and it leaves the system. Hope the videos, there's a sound.
Densely carpeting the respiratory tract. This was revealed by scanning electron microscope images.
Okay, great. Now just notice this is a video of what cilia look like, and
Size is indicated by this scale.
The
cilia are bathed in a watery fluid. The mucus layer, which traps debris, floats on top of this periciliary fluid, and
this is what we do in our lab too. When we do our challenge studies, we'll look through the microscope at tracheas. So we'll take a little ring of trachea, stick it under the microscope, and we'll look for the cilia beating. So on this left, you can see the movement of the cilia. It's very, very, very fast, and that's what you want. You want very quick movement, and you can even see there's some particles. There was one that just jumped by. It's actively moving. Okay, in a diseased IBV, and it went back. There we go. 1, 2, there we go. Now this one, the cilia aren't there, and you see all this mucus buildup, and there is no beating. It's motionless. This is an IBV infected bird, which is what we work with, and it causes ciliostasis. So cilia stop moving, things get stuck, they get mucus plugs, they can even suffocate if it gets bad. The effect of ammonia on respiratory disease can be seen. And what I really like about this study was they didn't just look at ammonia. They looked at what happens when you combine ammonia with other factors involved in air quality. For example, dust. That was on that chart I mentioned in the first slide. And dust, again, has feces and bacteria and all sorts of things that can challenge the bird. And then they also looked at a bacterial challenge with E. coli. So they exposed different groups of birds to either single treatments or all of them combined. And the important thing to note here is this treatment seemed to have the worst lesions where they received ammonia, dust, and E. coli. And you notice if you look at these pluses, this is where they had the most lesions. They seem to be concentrated mostly after 1 to 2 weeks. So this is when the birds are most affected pathologically. At about 3 and 4 weeks, this is in these are thoracic air sac lesions, by the way. At about 3 and 4 weeks, these pluses seem to, they're not quite as apparent, but there's not enough data to really draw too many conclusions, but just keep in mind that it does seem that there's a concentration of lesions in the first couple of weeks. And then that's when we think of this study, where I'm going to bring this up in the next few slides, because this relates to our research. Again, they looked microscopically at tissues and the lesions, and they found the same trend. When you combine multiple pathogens or multiple challenges together, then that seems to exacerbate respiratory disease. This is probably the only one of the very few studies that was actually a challenge study, where they exposed birds to ammonia, and then they challenged them with a respiratory pathogen. This was done in 1964, so we really don't have much going on. And they took 3 groups of chickens, and they exposed them to either 20 ppm of ammonia in A, 20 ppm of ammonia in B, or they upped it to 50 ppm. And then they challenged them, these were in isolators, in chambers, they challenged them with Newcastle disease in an aerosol format. And you can see the challenge dose, it was either 3 embryonic lethal doses or 6. And they found that there is a significant difference in that these birds that were exposed to ammonia were more susceptible to disease infection. And it didn't matter whether it was 20 or 50 ppm, even concentrations as low as 20 can increase disease susceptibility. Now keep in mind, these birds were exposed for just 72 hours or 48 hours, just 2 or 3 days. So this is acute exposure. Who knows what would have happened if it was over 2, 3, 4 weeks. And when you think about in the real life scenario, we want to think about, is this relevant to industry today? And the broilers that we raise, if we're talking about infectious bronchitis, typically challenges don't happen much before 3 weeks. So, and these birds are exposed to ammonia for several days to weeks. So this may not be totally representative of what we're trying to simulate in the field. The effects of ammonia and IBV vaccination. There's another study where they look to see what happened in these birds, especially production-wise in the performance parameters. What happened in these birds when you expose them to ammonia and you vaccinate with IBV? They took day-old white leghorn males, and they kept them, and this is shifted over, but they kept them for 4 weeks actually in chambers, and then they added ammonia at either 0, 25, or 50 ppm. And then the week later, they vaccinated with IBV in an aerosol, and they looked to see what was happening. So let's just talk about what stayed the same, the controlled birds versus ammonia birds. As expected, until they added the ammonia, relative humidity stayed the same. But that changed, and when they added ammonia, there seemed to be higher humidity levels. And actually, for the first, even weeks after they added ammonia, the litter moisture remained the same. The body weight remained the same. Feed efficiency wasn't changed. Lung weight wasn't changed. And they had no incidences of air sacculitis. But where the real issues happened was later on. And what they noticed was for the ammonia-stressed birds, in the week of vaccination, the bursa fabricius, if you remember the B cell factory, that was increased in size. And this leads us to think, well, possibly ammonia could be acting as an immunostimulant or a stressor that could enhance this response to vaccination. And interestingly, when they finished that study, the bursa fabricius was actually smaller than the controls. And there's not really any information to say for sure exactly why. It could be a negative consequence, or maybe in the natural decline of the size of bursa, it may have just expedited, the ammonia may have expedited the response. I don't know, and I'm not going to say. Body weight gain in the ammonia-stressed birds decreased, feed efficiency decreased, and finally lung weight and air sacculitis were notable. And that would make sense with what we know so far about ammonia. What we've learned from these studies, concentrations as low as 20 parts per million can cause structural and physiological changes that might normally go unnoticed on routine physical examination. And these ammonia-stressed birds appear to be more susceptible to disease. But let's keep in mind a few limitations of these studies, and I hope that we can address these in the next study that I'm going to show you. Very few challenge studies have been performed, and they do not reflect the field conditions and the management practices that our chickens are exposed to today. The timing of ammonia exposure is important, especially these birds, when they're younger, they're more likely to be exposed to ammonia. And then as they get older, they may or may not, because birds get bigger, ventilation increases, ammonia tends to go down. The duration of ammonia exposure. Acute duration, like let's say 2-3 days, versus chronic exposure. And is there this ability for these birds to have this rebound effect? And can they get used to it and compensate, and therefore maybe be more able to fight off infection if it comes later? The timing of vaccinations and challenges. Now, when we vaccinate a bird, we immunosuppress it, right? And that could be an opportunity for another pathogen to come in and colonize and cause disease. So we need to know what's going on immunologically in these birds, how are they responding to vaccination, and what's important is that in the real world, in industry, we will vaccinate these birds on, like at the hatchery, and then we usually do some field vaccinations depending on what kind of bird we're doing, and let's see how ammonia interacts with the vaccinations. All their genetic lines. I mean, I showed you a study from 1964. So I believe that a 1964 bird may have some different responses compared to the birds that we raised today in 2017. And importantly, it went away. But I had a picture of a chicken in a chamber. And the point of this message is that poultry studies with ammonia were all done in chambers. And that's a uniform environment without being able to expose them to all the normal disease pathogens and stresses that we see today in our chicken houses. So let's move outside the box. This is what our study entails. Recreate conditions similar to what is seen in commercial broiler houses. So in our study, we rear these birds on the floor. We use a tight house. We use reused litter. That gives us a natural source of ammonia, so we don't have any artificial sources. Ventilation is controlled by fans. Standard stocking density, heat sources, feed, and lighting schedule. And let's see how poor air quality affects the development of the immune response to vaccination with infectious bronchitis virus, as well as how well are these protected when we challenge them with IBV. And as you can imagine, how easy it is to create ammonia in the field, and think about now trying to create ammonia in a controlled setting. So we had some parameters between 30 and 60 ppm was great for us, and naturally there's going to be variations in ammonia. So the questions that we ask are, does poor air quality affect the immune response to vaccination? Does poor air quality affect immune protection against challenge with IBV? And let's go back to that chart, and let's not forget there's many factors involved in air quality. So our goal in this study was to include as many as possible, and for sure we had dust, ammonia, temperature, and relative humidity in there. The aim of the study was to determine the effect of reduced air quality on the immune response to IBV vaccination and protection against homologous challenge in broiler chickens. So in our study design, we're still in the middle of the study. Now I said this study is fresh off the farm, so never before seen data. We have 2 trials done already, and 3 and 4 to go. And what we did was we took day-of-age broiler chicks, and we placed them in pens, or in a tight house onto the floor, and we vaccinated them in the eye with IBV. And we watched to see what happened immunologically over time. So for the first 7 days, and 10 to 12 and 14 days, those are a proxy of how well are these birds responding to the vaccination in the face of ammonia and no ammonia. So we had several groups that we exposed them to either control groups. We had groups that were exposed to ammonia only, groups that were vaccinated and ammonia stressed, etc. And then on day 28, we challenged with IBV, with a homologous strain. This was a mass type IBV. And just before challenge, we collected samples all over again just to see Now, what does the immune system look like just before challenge? Because it might be different from just a couple weeks after vaccination. So let's see where these birds stand. How are they responding to the vaccine? And the procedures we did was we collected choanal swabs, looked at viral detection, clinical signs, and weight. We measured ciliostasis. And typically with IBV challenges, you collect the tracheas 5 days post-challenge to see if there's ciliostasis. We also conducted flow cytometry, histology, and we are looking also at mRNA transcripts in the trachea and looking at antibody production in the tears for IgA to look at what sort of local immunity are we generating, as well as systemically. Then after challenge, we collected samples days 10 to 14 and one sample at day 4 post-challenge just to see where the immune system was. Okay. This is what our birds were raised in. The left picture is showing birds raised on clean pine shavings. So these were our negative controls, no ammonia group. And you can see here, by the way, this pointer stopped working, but you can see here, these are the sensors we use to collect all our data, and they're kept at bird height. So this is actually, because ammonia levels, keep in mind too, when you're standing up here, you're 6 feet tall, ammonia is not the same as when you're down at chick level. So if you really want to know, stick your head in the ground and just try not to eat anything while you're there. On the right side, if you notice, the litter is used litter, and it's a little bit wet, it's chunky, and these birds are exposed to somewhere between 30 and 60 ppm. Air quality data. This was using our fancy sensors. In our trial 1, you see on the black up here is the temperature, and our relative humidity is in blue, and our ammonia is in red. You can see that, I'll show you in another one, that ammonia tends to stay between 30 and 60 ppm. Trial 2 shows a similar but a different. Thank you. This one?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. In trial 2, you see that this relative humidity stays the same, but ammonia seems to drop off after a couple weeks, and we have some theories as to why. But also keep in mind, trial 1 was conducted in the wintertime, January to February. Trial 2 was conducted in the spring. Spring, it got a little bit hotter, ventilation increased. It's possible that once these birds got to their exponential growth phase, about 2 weeks of age was when we had to kick on the fans. That seems to be the reason for why ammonia dropped. But what we noted was that birds were exposed to comparable ammonia levels in the first 2 weeks of age. This is the range that we tried to maintain, and it was hard, let me tell you, but we did it, and it's actually quite good in there. So there are a couple, as you would expect, there are a couple peaks and valleys in ammonia. And this is now showing you over the course of the trial. Again, the first 2 weeks stops about here, and then in trial 2, it drops off a little bit, and in trial 1, it stays about the same. But if you go back to the real-life scenario in the industry, birds, what seems to be the most important is ammonia exposure early on in the bird's life, while the bird's responding to vaccination and developing the immune response. Just to show you that we managed to keep our temperature and relative humidity the same, they seem to be overlaid over both trials. And then, now let's look at the results. So what we're looking at here is the viral load in the choanal cleft of the birds that we collected. And this was after the IBV challenge. So our CT value is basically just a measure of viral load. The higher these bars are, the lower the value, which means there's more virus. And this group here are our non-vaccinated birds, and as you would expect, our challenge group had really high viral load. And in our vaccinated birds, our non-challenge and challenge groups appear to be protected. Now, what was interesting is we were looking for, does ammonia have an effect on viral load? And it appears that it does not. So regardless of whether these birds are exposed to ammonia or not, their viral load stays the same. So they're not shedding more virus. Again, you can see the same results in trial 2. I will mention we did add a group in trial 2, and so in this group we had a non-ammonia, non-vaccinated group, but we also added an ammonia non-vaccinated group. So that explains why we have this extra bar here. So the point of this graph again is we have protection in our vaccinated birds, and there's no significant differences according to this with respect to ammonia exposure. Now we were curious to see what does a viral load look like in these birds as they age when thinking about ammonia and no ammonia. So this is pre-challenge right now showing, and I'll show you that at days 10 to 14, this immune response, or the viral loads seem to be quite high, and I'm missing something, but this is our negative control, and then these are the vaccinated birds. And then just before challenge, as you would expect, that viral load's gone down. It's not completely gone, but our non-vaccinated birds have nothing. And then post-challenge, which is in this gray box here, this is in the positive control, and as you would expect, it is quite high. The viral load is very high. And then these are the vaccinated birds, and they were clearly protected. And then 10 to 14 days post-challenge, even this positive control recovered down to background levels of viral load. So these birds, they got sick, but they got better. Trial 2 is showing similar results, and I'll show you that so you can see the legend here. But in days 7 and days 10 to 14, days post-vaccination, our vaccinated birds show this high level of virus. This is a vaccine virus, and then it decreases over time, and then it continues decreasing over time. And then after challenge, our positive controls get really high viral loads, but then they seem to recover down to background levels. Ciliostasis. Now, this was a big thing that we were curious about because we hear in these studies that ammonia causes ciliary damage, or at least impedes the ability of the cilia to clear mucus. So what we thought going in this trial was that we were going to see ciliostasis with the ammonia-exposed birds. And in fact, we didn't at all. And that was surprising to us. So in trial 1, ciliostasis, let me orient you first. This is a score on the y-axis, and anything above this red line passes the test. So that meant these tracheas were healthy. Cilia were beating. Anything below fails. And here, in our non-vaccinated challenge birds, all of the tracheas that we looked at had ciliostasis, complete ciliostasis. And then in all other groups, including the ammonia-exposed groups, they had no ciliostasis, or just one. Sometimes that can just be an artifact. In trial 2, very similar results. The positive control, as expected, had ciliostasis, but ammonia-exposed birds did not. And with respect to clinical signs, we think, okay, well, with challenge, birds that got exposed to ammonia, it would make sense that they might have more clinical signs. And in fact, that wasn't the case at all either. In our non-vaccinated challenge birds, this is our scoring system, which measures rails and SNCs in birds. So a 3 would be the highest score. That bird has rails. It's making a really raspy sound. You can hear liquid popping inside. And then going down to 0, it's no sounds at all. And our challenge non-vaccinated birds had quite a few clinical signs, but we had very few to none in our vaccinated birds. And ammonia wasn't implicated in this. Again, in trial 2, we had even more staggering results where our non-vaccinated challenge birds, every single bird we had a lot of rails, and then there were very few or no clinical signs in our vaccinated birds. Again, this idea with ammonia did not affect rails. However, air saculitis was a thing. And in our non-vaccinated challenge birds, we had about half of the birds had air sac. Now this was interesting to us because our ammonia group versus our non-ammonia group had more air sac than our non-ammonia group. We had 9 out of 10 birds affected versus 2 out of 5. And this also holds true in 9 out of 10 versus 5 out of 10. So we have more studies we need to do, but it seems that ammonia is involved in an increased incidence, an increased number of aerosaculitis birds. Now, just because there's so many studies done on body weight, we decided to measure body weight in the birds at the end of the trial that weren't challenged. So what this is showing here is our body weight on the y-axis and our non-vaccinated birds in purple, or non-vaccinated in purple and pink. And they seem to be significantly higher. The non-ammonia birds have higher weights than the ammonia birds. And that's significant here. It's not always significant, but at least it appears to be a trend in that ammonia-stressed birds have lower body weights versus the non-ammonia birds. And that's not new news. So this just adds to the research that we've conducted. So in our conclusions, our viral load was significantly reduced in vaccinated birds compared to non-vaccinated birds challenged with IBV. So that shows us the study worked, our challenge worked. But ammonia exposure was not associated with viral load. With ciliostasis, in the IBV challenged birds, non-vaccinated birds showed ciliostasis, while vaccinated birds were protected. And ammonia exposure was not associated with ciliostasis either. With respect to clinical signs, non-vaccinated birds had elevated clinical signs, but the vaccinated birds had few to none. And ammonia exposure did not influence clinical signs. However, it was associated with an increased incidence of aerosaculitis. With respect to body weight, the ammonia-stressed birds had reduced body weights compared to control birds. And we're in the middle of a study. We have a lot more data we need to analyze, so especially along the immunological side of things. So some of the things that we have planned are to characterize markers of the innate and adaptive immune responses. For example, looking at interferons, cytokines, toll-like receptors, and immune cell markers in respiratory and systemic tissues, like the MHC class 1, class 2 presentation, CD4 and CD8 expression, and IgM and IgA producing cells in the respiratory tissues. Also, we want to see what IBV specific and total IgA levels are in the respiratory tissues. So we collect tear samples and we look at the IgA in there to see if there's any differences. And finally, determine cell types, morphology, and numbers infiltrating respiratory and systemic tissues. And also visualizing tracheal tissue structure. For more information, this is an excellent resource. This is at the University of Georgia. Doctors Fairchild and Mike Sarek have a publication or multiple publications and newsletters where they talk about poultry ventilation. So for any questions, anything you need, I go there all the time to read up on it. Poultryventilation.com. And I'd like to acknowledge the USDA for the grant and my advisors, Dr. Mark Jackwood, Dr. Brian Jordan, Dr. Brian Fairchild, and Dr. Robert Gogol and David Hurley, who are the immunologists involved in this study, and Dr. Maria Carmen Garcia. And finally, Debbie Hilton Sunny Chang, who have been helping me in this study.